The next day, you'll speak to the United Nations in a much anticipated address. The first time you've been there in a number of years. What will you say? There is much anticipation that you will speak about the threat of ISIS and that your presence in Syria is related to that. What is the purpose of the presence in Syria, and how does that relate to the challenge of ISIS?
In regards to our, as you said, presence in Syria, today it's expressed in the form of supplying weapons to the Syrian government, training of the personnel, rendering humanitarian assistance to the Syrian people.
В оказании гуманитарной помощи сирийскому народу. Мы исходим из Устава Организации Объединенных Наций, то есть из основополагающих
We proceed from the UN Charter, which means from the fundamental principles of international law, under which any assistance, including military, can and should be rendered exclusively to a legitimate government of a country with their consent or at their request, or upon the decision of the UN Security Council. In this case, we are dealing with a request from the Syrian government to render them military and technical assistance, which we're doing within the framework of lawful international contracts.
Secretary of State John Kerry said the United States welcomes your assistance in the battle against ISIS. Others have taken note of the fact that these are fighter planes, anti-aircraft systems, and those are for use against a conventional army, not extremist.
Там есть только одна обычная легитимная армия. Это армия президента Сирии.
There is only one legitimate conventional army, and that is the army of the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, and he's facing, according to the interpretation of some of our international partners, the opposition. But in fact, really, in real life, the army of Bashar al-Assad is dealing with terrorist organizations. Surely you know better than I about the hearings which have just taken place in the Senate, if I'm not mistaken, where the military, the representatives from the Pentagon, reported to the senators about what had been done by the United States in order to train the combat units of the opposition forces. They at first had the goal to train 5,000 or 6,000 troops, then 12,000. And then it turned out they had prepared and trained all of the troops. But the only number that were fighting were 4 or 5 men. And all the others, with American weapons, defected to ISIS. That's the first point. Secondly, I believe that providing aid to illegitimate organizations is not in line with international law and the Charter of the United Nations. We support only legitimate government organizations.
So you would like to join the United States in the fight against ISIS. That's part of why you're there. Others think that while that may be part of your goal, you're trying to save the Assad administration because they've been losing ground and the war has not been going well for them, and you're there to rescue them.
Правильно, так и есть. Мы оказываем, я уже это сказал дважды в ходе нашей беседы, могу повторить в третий раз, мы оказываем поддержку легитимным властям Сирии.
Correct, that's the case. And I've already said it twice during our talk. I'll repeat it for the third time. We support the legitimate government of Syria. And furthermore, it's my deep conviction that any actions to the contrary in order to destroy the legitimate governments will create a situation which you can witness now in the other countries of the region, or in other regions of the world, for instance in Libya, where all the state institutions are disintegrated. We see a similar situation, regrettably, in Iraq. And there is no other solution whatsoever to the Syrian crisis than strengthening the existing legal government structures and rendering them help in fighting terrorism, but at the same time urging them to engage in positive dialogue with the rational part of the opposition and with conducting political reforms.
As you know, some of the coalition partners want to see President Assad go first, before they will support?
Я бы хотел бы им посоветовать или рекомендовать.
I'd like to advise them and recommend to them the following.
Вот это пожелание направить сирийскому народу.
They should send this wish to the Syrian people and not to Assad. It's only the Syrian people inside the country who are entitled to decide who should govern their country and how, and by what principles. I believe any advice from the outside is inappropriate, harmful, and contrary to international law.
Here is what the Washington Post said in an editorial today. Into the vacuum of American leadership, has stepped Russian President Vladimir Putin, who has dispatched troops and equipment to Syria in an effort to force the world to accept his solution to the war, which is the creation of a new coalition to fight the Islamic State that includes in the coalition the Assad government. The interesting thing they are saying is that you have moved into a vacuum of American leadership. The Washington Post.
Мы не заполняем вакуум американского лидерства. Мы пытаемся предотвратить создание.
Well, we're not filling the vacuum of American leadership. We're trying to prevent the creation of a vacuum in the government of Syria in general. Because as soon as government agencies are destroyed in a given state or a given country, that's when a power vacuum occurs. And at that moment, it will be instantly filled with terrorists. That was the case in Libya, and that was the case in Iraq. That was the case in some other countries, in Somalia, and this was the case in Afghanistan as well. For us, there's no question of any fight with the American leadership at all.
Well, the vacuum for leadership. It seems to be, in knowing you, you have said that a strong centralized government is in the DNA of Russia. You know, and you have a huge fear, as you suggest, in anarchy, maybe in Syria and in other places, of no strong government. That's the fear that Vladimir Putin has.
Well, I'm not saying that there's no strong government in the country. I'm saying that if there is no government at all, then there will be anarchy and a vacuum. And this vacuum and anarchy will rapidly transform into terrorism.
You know,
well, take Iraq, for example. There was a well-known figure, Saddam Hussein. Whether he was good or bad, you've probably forgotten that. At some stage, the U.S. was cooperating very actively with Saddam when he was fighting Iran. You've helped him with arms, the diplomatic support was accorded, political cover was provided, etc. Then, for some reason, you had a falling out and the U.S. decided to eliminate Saddam. But by eliminating Saddam Hussein, the U.S. eliminated the Iraqi government and thousands of people from the former Ba'ath Party. Thousands of Iraqi servicemen, which were a part of the Sunni elite of the state, were thrown out on the streets. Nobody thought about them. Now they're filling the ranks of ISIL. That's what we're fighting against. We are not against some country showing its leadership somewhere. We're against thoughtless actions that result in such negative situations that are hard to correct.
You have a popularity rating in Russia that would make every politician in the world envious. Why are you so popular?
There's something that I have in common with every citizen of Russia, the love of our motherland.
While you're also popular, as you know, and forgive me, but there are many people who are critical of Russia, as you know. They say that it's more autocratic and less democratic. They say that political opponents and journalists have been killed and imprisoned in Russia. They say your power is unchallenged, and they say that power and absolute power corrupts absolutely. What do you say to those people who worry about the climate, the atmosphere in Russia?
Не может быть никакой демократии без соблюдения
Well,
закона.
there can be no democracy without implementation of the law and compliance with the law. Everyone must observe the laws. This is the most important thing which we must bear in mind. No one must forget that. As for those tragic events, such as the death of people, including journalists, unfortunately, they do occur in all countries of the world. But if they happen in our country, we do the utmost to find the criminals and to punish them. And we'll do this in all directions. But the most important thing is that we will continue to improve our political system so that people can feel, every citizen can feel, that they do influence the country and the society, so that the authorities would feel responsible with regard to those people who trust them during election campaigns.
I mean, as you well know, if you, as a leader of this country, insist that the rule of law be adhered to, if you insist that justice be done, if you, because of your power, then it could go a long way to eliminating that perception.
Ну, можно многое, но не у всех и не все сразу получается.
Well, a lot
Вот,
can be
в
done,
Соединенных
but
Штатах сколько
not everyone
демократических
succeeds with
процессов
everything from the
развивается?
very start.
Ну, с самого
So
начала
here,
создания
how long did it
Соединенных Штатов.
take the democratic
Ну, а что,
process
сейчас
to
вы
develop
считаете,
in the
что всё
United
решено
States?
с точки зрения
Since the
демократии?
very beginning
Если
of
бы
the
всё было
creation
решено,
of the
то не
United
было бы
States?
проблемы
Do you
Фергюсона,
believe that
правда?
everything is perfect
Не
now
было бы
from the
других
point of view of
проблем подобного
democracy?
рода.
If
Не было бы
everything was
произвола
perfect,
полиции.
there would be
Но
no
вот,
problem like Ferguson, right?
но
There
наша
would be
задача
no other
заключается в том,
problems of a
чтобы
similar nature.
видеть
There
все
would
эти
be no
проблемы
abuse by the
и
police.
вовремя
But our
и
task is to
должным
see
образом на это
all these
реагировать. То же
problems
самое
and to
касается
react
России. У нас тоже
properly
много
in
проблем.
due time. This is the same case in Russia. A lot of problems.
So the people who killed Mr. Nemtsov will be prosecuted to the fullest.
Я сразу об этом сказал.
Yes,
что
I
это
said it right away
позорная
that this is a
страница в
shameful
нашей
page in our
современной
modern
истории.
history,
И
today's
преступники
history,
должны быть
and
найдены и
criminals must be
заключены.
prosecuted and
Значит,
punished.
наказаны. Может быть, это не сразу делается.
Well, probably
но
this
у нас
cannot
есть
be
другие
done in a
примеры,
second, but we have had other
преступлений
examples
подобного
of crimes
рода.
of this
И в
kind.
конечном итоге,
And finally, in the
несмотря на
end,
то, что
despite the fact that these
расследование
investigations
достаточно долго,
continue
но
for quite a long
приходит к
time,
своему логичному
it concluded in a due manner.
You know that I admire Russia and its culture very much, its literature, its music. It is a large country, a big country. And many people, including Stalin, have said Russia needs a strong, authoritative figure. They worship, Stalin said, that kind of figure. Was Stalin right?
Нет. Я не помню, где он это говорил.
No, he was wrong. I don't remember him saying that, so I can't confirm those quotes. Russia, as any other country in the world, needs just principles for state structure, rather than dictators. Russia needs these principles which flexibly respond to these changes inside the country and outside the country. That's what Russia needs.
Изменения мира внутри страны и вовне. Вот что нужно России.
But there is a tradition of strong leadership here. Of all those people, who do you...
Вы знаете, значит, вот смотрите, в большинстве европейских стран
Well, you know, in most European countries, there's parliamentary democracy. Japan has it, many countries have it. But for some reason, the state structure of the U.S. is quite different. It's a quite rigid presidential republic. Each country has its own special features, its own traditions, which are reflected in today and will be reflected in the future. We also have such traditions in Russia, but we're not talking about some strong figure, although of course such a figure is needed in the leadership. But we need to find an explanation about who this strong man is. Is it a dictator, or is it just a leader who acts within his duties by the law and for the sake of the interest of the major part of the population? If he's acting consistently and in a principled way, this is a totally different situation. So I believe that Russia does need such people, the second type I've mentioned.
И принципиально, то это совершенно другое. Вот я считаю, что Россия вот в таких людях второго
A second class. Russia needs that much more than just people with dictator pretensions.
As you know, some have called you a czar.
Ну что? Меня,
well, what of it?
You
know, people call me different names.
Does the name fit?
No, it doesn't fit me. You know, we have a saying, call me a pot if you want, just don't put me in the oven. It's not important what you're called, whether by your well-wishers, friends, or your political opponents. What's important is what you yourself think about what you must do for the interests of the country, which has entrusted you with such a position, with such a post, as the head of the Russian state.
Are people in Russia fearful of you?
Думаю, что нет.
I think not.
Я исхожу из того, что большинство людей мне доверяет.
I proceed from the fact that most people trust me if they vote for me at the election. And this is the most important thing. It places enormous responsibility on me, colossal. And I'm grateful to people for this trust, but at the same time I feel this huge burden of responsibility for doing what I do and for the results of my work.
Well, as you know, in America, you're much talked about in America. There's much conversation, more so than any...
Maybe they have nothing else to do in America but to talk about.
No, or maybe they're curious people. Or maybe you're an interesting character. Maybe that's what it is. But they see this, first of all, a strong leader who presents himself in a strong way. They know of a former KGB agent who came back and got into politics in St. Petersburg and became deputy mayor and then came to Moscow. And the interesting thing is they see these images of you bare-chested on a horse, and they say, there is a man who carefully cultivates his image of strength. I'm asking...
Знаете, мне кажется, что...
You know, I'm convinced that a person who occupies my post must provide a positive example to people. And those areas where he can do this, he's obligated to do this.
В тех областях, где он может делать это, он делать это обязан.
In our country, in the 1990s and early 2000s, we had a very severe situation with the social sphere. The social security system was destroyed. A lot of problems emerged that we still, to this day, cannot effectively resolve fully. In the sphere of healthcare, in the development of sports, and I think that a healthy lifestyle is extremely important.
Это чрезвычайно важная вещь.
And it's the foundation of the resolution of many crucial problems, including the health of the nation. It's impossible to solve the healthcare problems of millions of people only by using pills. People need to have the habits or passion, or there even has to be a fashion of healthy lifestyle, of sports. So I believe that this is a right thing when not only I, but other colleagues like heads of government, ministries, and legislators of the State Duma, when, as today, for example, they participate in the two-distance marathon races, when they attend soccer matches, when they participate in sports competitions themselves. So this is, well, including from... This is where the love of millions of people of sports comes from.
Не только, но в том числе. Зарождается интерес или любовь миллионов людей к занятиям физической культурой и спорту. Я считаю, что
I think it's extremely important.
Are you curious about America? More than simply another nation that you have to deal with. because they're curious about you, as I suggested. Are you curious? Are you watching the Republican political debates?
Наблюдать так, чтобы совсем уже в ежедневном режиме.
Well, I wouldn't say I watch them daily, no. But of course we're curious about what's going on in the U.S. It's a major world power, an economic and military leader. So, of course, America exerts great influence on the situation in the world in general. And of course, we're interested in what's going on. And we keep a close watch, but I don't watch the internal political saga on an everyday basis. I'd say more likely no.
Yeah. Because if you watch that, I mean, it's Donald Trump says, you know who he is. He said he would like to meet you because he thinks the two of you would get along. And Donald Trump.
Да, я слышал, да, я слышал. Ну, мы будем рады.
Yeah, I heard that. Well, we'll be glad to have any contact with the next president of the United States. Any person who gains the trust of the American people can count on the fact that we will work with him.
What do you admire most about America?
Творческий подход к решению.
I like the creativity
Открытость.
Creativity when it comes to your tackling problems. Their openness, because it allows them to unleash the inner potential of their people. And thanks to that, America has attained such great results in developing their country.
Потрясающих успехов в развитии в своем развитии.
Russia had Sputnik. You were there before the United States. Russia has extraordinary astrophysicists. Russia has extraordinary leaders in medicine and in science and in physics. I mean, do you hope that what you can do is restore that leadership and create the same kind of innovation that you just admired America for? And how will you do that?
Нам нужно не утратить то, что было создано за предыдущие десятилетия.
We shouldn't lose what was created in the previous decades, and we should create the very conditions for showing the potential of our people, because we're a very talented people. We have a very good basis, which you mentioned. You said that you love Russian culture. I think that's a great basis for internal development. You've just mentioned our achievements in science and many other areas. We must support that. We must create conditions for people to develop freely, for them to feel confident that they're able to realize their potential.
Чувствовали себя в состоянии реализовать свой потенциал, уверен, просто абсолютно убежден в том, что это.
And I'm confident that we will have an effect on the consistent development of science, of high-tech technologies, and of the economy in the country overall.
Да, и всей экономики страны.
Ukraine. You and I have talked about Ukraine before. Many believe that as a result of what happened in Ukraine and Crimea, the United States and the West imposed sanctions. And those sanctions have hurt Russia. And that you believe by reemerging and in trying to be a positive force around the world and in Syria, that it might somehow lessen the focus on Ukraine.
Не очень. Чтобы отвлечь внимание от украинской
So do you mean that will help to somehow distract the attention from the Ukrainian crisis?
Yes.
So our actions in Syria are aimed at distracting? Is that what you mean? No. Ukraine is a separate and major issue for us. Syria is a different issue. And I told you why. We don't want the disintegration of Syria. We don't want the return of terrorists and of those who engage in warfare coming back to Russia. So there's a whole complexity of problems. When it comes to Ukraine, that's a separate issue. It's our closest neighbor. We've always said that it's our brother country.
Это не просто славянский народ, это самый близкий к русскому народу.
It's not only the Slavs. Our languages are very similar. We have common history, common culture, common religion. and many things in common.
Что я считаю абсолютно неприемлемым.
What I believe is absolutely inadmissible is the resolution of internal political issues in the former USSR republics through color revolutions, through coup d'état, through unconstitutional removal of power.
С помощью переворотов и неконституционным способом смещения власти действующей. Вот это абсолютно неприемлемо. Вот наши партнеры в
That is totally unacceptable. Our partners in the United States have supported those who ousted Yanukovych.
Прямо говорят, некоторые прямо сказали, что чуть ли несколько миллиардов.
You believe that the United States had something to do with the ousting of Yanukovych, and he had to flee to Russia.
Я знаю об этом точно.
I know that for sure.
Очень просто, потому что
I know those people who live in Ukraine. We have thousands of contacts with them. We know where and when, and who met with someone, and who worked with those who ousted Yanukovych, how they were supported, how much they were paid, how they were trained, where, in which countries, and who those instructors were.
Как готовили, на каких территориях, в каких странах, и кто были эти инструкторы.
We know everything. And our American partners don't try to conceal that anyway. They said, yes, well, we did. We did train them. And we spent that much money. And it amounts to $5 billion. So there's no secret about it.
Здесь секрета-то нет.
Yeah, but I mean, you're suggesting that this...
Никто с этим уже не спорит.
Nobody's even arguing against that.
You respect the sovereignty of Ukraine?
Конечно.
Sure, but we want other countries to respect the sovereignty of other countries and Ukraine in particular. Respect for sovereignty means to not allow unconstitutional action and coup d'état, the removal of legitimate power.
How will
that is something that should not be...
How will the renewal of legitimate power take place in your judgment? How will that come about? And what role will Russia play?
Россия никогда не принимает и не собирается принимать участие в действиях, направленных на...
Russia has not taken part and is not going to take part in any actions aimed at removing the legitimate government.
То результат очень тяжелый.
What I'm saying is that somebody does that. The result is very difficult to deal with. In Libya, we've seen the disintegration of the state. In Iraq, we've seen the territory's been filled with terrorists. In Syria, the situation is unfolding the same way. In Afghanistan, you very well know what the situation looks like. What happened in Ukraine? The coup d'état led to a civil war. Many citizens of Ukraine did not have trust in Yanukovych, that's true. But they should have gone to the elections and elected a new leader, not commit the removal of power. But after the coup d'état, somebody supported that, somebody liked it, but somebody did not. And those who did not like it were treated from the position of force.
Начали разговаривать с позиции силы. Результат – гражданская война.
I repeat, what are you prepared to do?
Сейчас скажу.
Let me tell you, if your question is about that, I believe Russia and other international actors, those who are more actively engaged in the resolution of the Ukrainian crisis, I mean Germany and France, the so-called Normandy Four, of course with the active engagement of the United States. And in that direction we have intensified our dialogue in this sphere. We all should strive for full and unconditional implementation of the Minsk agreements. The Minsk agreements must be fulfilled.
Полному и безусловному исполнению тех договоренностей, которые достигнуты были в Минске. Надо исполнять Минские договоренности.
But that's exactly what John Kerry said yesterday, coming out of a meeting with the British foreign minister. He mentioned after Syria, Ukraine. And he said, we have to have a full implementation of the Minsk agreements. So you and John Kerry are just like this. You agree. Implement the Minsk agreement.
In full. In full. Could you please have enough patience and not interrupt me for 2 minutes?
Но я вас прошу,
And I
чтобы
ask
вы
you to
дали
please present this without
то, что я
cuts.
скажу, без купюр. Сможете это сделать? У вас хватит?
Can you do this? Do you have enough power to do this, to present it without cuts?
Yes.
Исполнение Минских соглашений означает, там несколько пунктов, я скажу о главном.
The implementation of the Minsk agreements means there are several articles, but I'll speak about the main point so that the situation in Ukraine changes fundamentally.
Первое. Нужно принять изменения.
There should be political reform. That's first. There should be constitutional changes. That's what's set forth in the Minsk
И
agreements.
теперь самое главное. В Минских
Then,
соглашениях
most
написано,
important, the Minsk agreements state this should be done in coordination with Donetsk and Luhansk.
это принципиальный вопрос.
And that is a matter of principle.
На Украине сейчас
Ukraine,
принимаются
there are
изменения.
reforms introduced in the constitution in the first reading, but there's been no coordination with Luhansk and Donetsk at all, and no one even intends to coordinate
И никто
anything
даже не
with them.
собирается с ними ничего согласовывать.
That's point one.
Теперь
Point
пункт 2.
two,
Нужно
it's stated in the Minsk agreements that there should be the implementation of the law.
имплементировать
The law was
закон,
already passed
уже
in
принятый на
Ukraine
Украине
of
закон
the special
об
self-governance
особенностях
status of those
местного
territories.
самоуправления на этих территориях. Закон принят,
They've adopted this law.
Но его введение
Its
отложено.
implementation has been postponed.
Минские соглашения.
That means that the Minsk agreements are not fulfilled on this point.
Третье. Нужно было
And
принять
third, there should have been the amnesty law.
Как
How can
можно
one
вести
engage in a
диалог
dialogue
с
with
людьми из
people from
Донбасса,
Donbass and Luhansk and
из Луганска и
Donetsk
Донецка?
if they're all being
Если все они
prosecuted?
находятся
They're all being
под
brought
уголовным
legal
преследованием.
charges against them.
Против всех
That's
из них
why the
возбуждено
Minsk
уголовное
agreements
дело.
say that a law
Поэтому в
on
Минских
amnesty
соглашениях
must be
написано
adopted,
принять закон об
but it's
амнистии.
not been adopted.
Он не принят. И есть еще ряд пунктов. Вот, например,
And there are other points as
провести
well.
местные
For
выборы.
example, conducting local elections. It's been written in the Minsk agreements to adopt a law on local elections upon coordination with Donetsk and Luhansk. Ukraine has adopted the law on local
Три
elections.
раза направляли свои предложения
The
по этому
representatives of Donetsk and
ними даже
Luhansk
никто не стал
sent their
разговаривать.
proposals on
Хотя
this
в
law
Минских
3
соглашениях
times,
написано,
but
после
nobody
голосования
even
в
talked to
Минске.
them.
Поэтому я очень
The Minsk
уважаю
agreements
и
say,
даже
with
люблю
coordination
господина
with
Керри, он
Donetsk
очень
and
опытный
Luhansk.
дипломат.
That's why I respect and love Mr. Kerry. He's an extremely experienced diplomat, very experienced diplomat.
Вот если бы он принимал
He
решение по
told me that
может
he
быть,
was
не было бы
against
сейчас
Star
конфликта у нас
Wars back in the
по
past,
противоракетной обороне.
and it was the right thing to do. Because maybe if he was the one who adopted decisions on ABM, we probably wouldn't have any conflicts on ABM right now. But if one side says, we've done this, that, and that, we've complied with the Minsk agreements, it's not true. Because all these points must be implemented in coordination with Donetsk and Luhansk. There has been no coordination so far. As for the implementation of the already adopted law on the special self-governance of these territories, the Minsk agreements say within 30 days. Nothing has been done yet. It's been postponed. The entering into force of this law has been postponed. That's why we advocate the full and unconditional implementation of the Minsk agreements by both sides, not as interpreted by one of the sides, but as it's written down in the Minsk agreements.
You really believe that?
There's nothing to believe, actually. It's written on paper. You just need to read it. It's written in coordination with Donetsk and Luhansk. Read the document for yourself, and I'm telling you there has been no coordination at all. It was written to adopt the law on the special status within 30 days. But the law has not been enforced. So who's not implementing the Minsk agreements?
You've mentioned the Secretary of State. He also said that it's important not only to implement the Minsk agreement, but also for separatists to give up the idea of independent elections. John Kerry said that yesterday.
Да, ну, да, значит, я знаю позицию.
Well, yes, I know the position of our U.S. friends, and here's what I want to say in this regard. I just mentioned this. I see I'm forced to repeat it. The Minsk agreements say that a law on local elections must be passed in coordination with Donetsk and Luhansk.
По согласованию с Донецком и Луганском. Что произошло в действительности?
So what happened in reality? The Kiev authorities did adopt the law on their own without any coordination or negotiations with Donetsk and Luhansk, in spite of the fact that Donetsk and Luhansk sent their draft 3 times. There was no dialogue at all. They've adopted this on their own without any consultations. Moreover, the law that was adopted by Kiev says that in these territories there will not be elections at all. How are we to understand this? In fact, they themselves have provoked the representative of Donetsk and Luhansk to schedule their own elections. That's all there is to it.
Okay.
So we're ready together with Mr. Kerry to discuss all of this, but we need to prod both sides to implement what they've put their signatures to, rather than to pass off as something good what they've done on their own initiative.
I hear you, but I wanted to repeat that because Secretary Kerry emphasized separatist elections. I did hear you. Here is what I think.
Well, he's being cunning. As Secretary of State and as a diplomat, he's being cunning. It's quite normal for his profession and for his work. All diplomats are quite cunning. So is he.
You would never do that, would you?
No, I would never do that. I'm not a diplomat.
What are you? How do you see yourself?
Человек. Гражданин Российской Федерации.
I'm a human being. I'm a citizen of the Russian Federation. I'm a Russian.
You also have said that the worst thing that happened last century was the collapse of the Soviet Empire. There are those who look at Ukraine, especially Ukraine and Georgia, and they believe that you do not want to recreate the Soviet Empire, but you do want to recreate a sphere of influence which you think Russia deserves because of the relationship that has existed. Why are you smiling?
Вы меня радуете.
Why?
You're making me happy because we're always suspected of some ambitions, and they always try to distort something or hint at something. I indeed said that I believe that the collapse of the USSR was a huge tragedy of the 20th century. You know why? Because first of all, in a single instant, 25 million Russian people found themselves beyond the borders of the Russian Federation. Here they had been living within the borders of a unified state, and always traditionally the Soviet Union had been called Russia, Soviet Russia. Well, this was Greater Russia. Then all of a sudden the USSR collapsed, just overnight in fact, right? And it's turned out that in former Soviet republics there were people, Russian people, numbering 25 million. They had been living in a single country, and all of a sudden they turned out to be abroad. You can imagine how many problems arose. First of all, there were everyday problems, economic problems, social problems, the separation of families. You can't list them all. Do you think it's normal that 25 million people, Russian people, wound up abroad all of a sudden? Russians turned out to be the largest divided nation in the world today. Is that not a problem? Well, not for you, but it's a problem for me.
And what do you intend to do about it?
What we want to do is use modern civilized processes to preserve, at least at a minimum, the common humanitarian space. To make it so that these state borders do not get in the way, so that people can communicate freely among themselves, so that we can develop our economies jointly. We want to take advantage of those benefits of the former USSR that we've inherited. What are these benefits? Joint infrastructure, a unified railroad system, a unified highway system, a unified energy system, And finally, if I dare say it, the great Russian language which unites all former republics of the Soviet Union and which gives us evident competitive advantages when promoting various integration projects in the territory of the post-Soviet space. You've probably heard that we first established the customs union and then we've transformed it into the Eurasian Economic Union. So when people can communicate freely and move freely, when workforces, goods, services, and capital move freely, there are no state lines when we have our common rules and legal regulation in the social sphere, for example. Then this is quite enough. People must feel free.
But do you have to use and show military force to accomplish that objective?
No, of course not.
You have a military presence on the border of Ukraine, and some even argue that there have been Russian troops in Ukraine.
Well, you have a military presence in Europe.
Yes.
The tactical nuclear weapons of the United States are in Europe. Let's not forget that. What does that mean? Does it mean that you've occupied Germany? Or that you renounced the occupation of Germany after World War II? And then you have only transformed the occupation forces into NATO forces? One could put it that way, but we're not putting it that way. And if we have our military forces on our border, on our territory, on the border with some state, you believe this is a crime?
I didn't say a crime.
Well, in order to run these activities that I've told you about, this economic, humanitarian, and social integration, military force would not be needed at all. We've built our customs union, the Eurasian Economic Union, not with the use of force, but through seeking a compromise. This is a complicated process, a difficult, long-standing process, through negotiations and through the search for a compromise on mutually beneficial and acceptable conditions, with the exception that we would create for our people and for our economies more effective advantages in world markets and in the international arena in general. That's why I'm deeply convinced that we should abandon the phobias of the past. We should look ahead and act based on the international law to build good neighborly relations on an equal footing.
And eliminate sanctions.
Well, if someone likes to work so much through using sanctions, go ahead, you can do that, but it's harmful. It goes against international law, as I've mentioned, first of all. And secondly, tell me where the policy of imposing sanctions has been effective. Nowhere, especially with regard to a country like Russia.
Even your friends worry about the Russian economy because of sanctions first, but also declining oil prices. You know. Is that a huge challenge for you? Is that a troubling global economic reality?
You know, as I said, sanctions are illegal actions which violate the principles of the world economy, the principles of the WTO, the United Nations, because sanctions can be introduced only by the decision of the UN Security Council, because unilaterally that is a violation of international law. Well, let's leave it aside. Of course sanctions are harmful. But they're not the main reason for the slump in the growth of the Russian economy or other problems related to inflation. The main reason for us really is the drop in prices on the world market for our traditional export commodities, such as oil and gas and some other goods.
Вот это главное. Но санкции, они, конечно, добавляют сюда.
When it comes to sanctions, they add to the negative side. They do have an influence one way or another, although they don't have a capital, fundamental importance for our economy.
You can survive sanctions.
Well, that goes without saying, no doubt. It's beyond discussion. There's even a certain positive side to it. Do you know what the advantage is? It's many things, especially when it comes to high technologies. We used to prefer to buy them, to use our petrodollars. But now, since these sanctions are imposed, we either can't buy these technologies, or we fear that something may be closed off to us, and now we're forced to introduce entire programs for developing our own high-tech economy in industry, manufacturing, and science. And that's in fact something we would have to do anyway. But it was difficult for us before because our own domestic markets were flooded with foreign goods. So in the WTO, it was difficult to support our local manufacturers. But now that the sanctions have been imposed, our partners have voluntarily left our market. Now we have a chance for development.
Let me have two more questions first.
Пожалуйста.
Of course, you have the floor.
You've been president, prime minister, president. How long do you want to serve? And what do you want to be your legacy? One question.
Это зависит, как долго, зависит от двух обстоятельств.
Well, how long? That depends on two things. First of all, unquestionably, there are regulations provided for by the Constitution, and they'll never be violated by me for certain. But I'm not sure that I should fully exercise all these constitutional rights. That'll depend on the specific situation in the country and the world, well, on my own sentiments about it.
And what do you want your legacy to be?
That Russia should be effective, competitive, should have a sustainable economy, with a developed social and political system that is flexible, both in regard to changes within and around the country.
And should play a major role in the world that it lives.
It should be competitive, as I said, and should be in a position to defend its own interests and to influence those processes which are significant to it.
Many say you're all-powerful here in Russia. Many say you're all-powerful. And they believe that you can have anything you want. Anything. What do you want? Tell America, tell the world what Vladimir Putin wants.
I want for Russia to be as I've just described it. That's really my main desire. I want people to be happy, and that our partners all over the world would want to and would strive to develop relations with Russia.
Thank you.